Western governments frequently project their own imperialist crimes onto China, and they claim that communist China plans on creating an empire and taking over the world and colonizing Africa, doing exactly what they did, what the European and North American colonialists did and continue to do around the global South. And the hypocrisy of this incredible imperial projection cannot be any clearer than in Iraq. The US government has tortured the people of Iraq for decades. In the 1980s, Iraq invaded Iran and waged a war to try to overthrow the newly revolutionary government in Iran after the revolution of 1979. The US supported Iraq in that invasion. Over 1 million Iranians and Iraqis died in that war that went on from 1980 until 1988. The US government supported both sides in order to drag the war on as long as possible. Henry Kissinger infamously said, "We wish both sides could lose." In addition, after that, then in 1990 and 1991, the US waged the Gulf War, the first war in Iraq. The US devastated civilian infrastructure, bombing hospitals, bombing schools, bombing roads, destroying bridges. The US top officials overseeing that policy boasted of sending Iraq back to the Dark Ages, back to the Stone Ages. That was the language they used. They boasted publicly of that. Then, in the 1990s, after the devastation of that war, the US led a brutal genocidal sanctions campaign on Iraq that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, including reportedly more than 500,000 Iraqi children. That number has been disputed, but in an infamous interview on 60 Minutes, former US Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, Madeleine Albright, defended the death of more than 500,000 Iraqi children from these US-led sanctions. So even if the number was not accurate, she was willing to defend 500,000 dead children caused by US-led sanctions.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Then, as if that was not enough, as if killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqis with these brutal sanctions was not enough, the US invaded Iraq in 2003 and militarily occupied it for over a decade. And still today, although the US claimed it ended the war in Iraq, Barack Obama claimed he ended the war in Iraq, there are still US soldiers in Iraq. And they are there illegally, militarily occupying the country, despite the fact that after Trump murdered Iran's top general Qasem Soleimani and the top Iraqi general who oversaw the private military forces that helped defeat ISIS in collaboration with the Iraqi military and Iraqi state. His name was Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. Trump murdered both of them in January of 2020. And the Iraqi parliament voted unanimously to expel U.S. troops, all foreign troops that are militarily occupying Iraq. The U.S. still has troops there illegally occupying Iraq. Meanwhile, Washington accuses China of having imperial pretensions, of trying to colonize Africa and all this nonsense. Well, what is China actually doing in the region? Here's an article in an Iraqi media outlet, a Middle Eastern media outlet, titled, "China Launches Its 1,000 Schools Project in Iraq." That is what China is doing. The great Chinese threat is building 1,000 schools in Iraq, while the U.S. continues to militarily occupy Iraq. So this is from Shafaq News. This is on June 18th. It says, a groundbreaking ceremony was held for the first educational project between Iraq and China. Iraq's Prime Minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, attended the ceremony. In December of 2021, the Iraqi government signed 15 contracts with China to build 1,000 schools in Iraq. And China and Iraq have boosted their relations. This article notes that China-Iraq energy cooperation has been the cornerstone of their bilateral relationship since 1981. Chinese companies today are involved in operations in Iraq, in oil operations, and Iraq is one of the top suppliers of crude oil to China. Here's a very important part. So while the U.S. was waging this neo-colonial occupation of Iraq that has really never ended, China, on the other hand, had vehemently opposed the 2003 Iraq War and called for a withdrawal of all U.S. forces from the country. And then this article notes that in 2021, Iraq became a top recipient of Chinese investment and a critical link in Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. Almost 20 years after the U.S. war in Iraq began in 2003, billions of Chinese yuan are being invested in assorted projects from green energy capabilities and heavy oil plants to building roads and schools. So the U.S. bombs and China builds. The U.S. bombs Iraq and militarily occupies it, and China builds schools and roads and infrastructure. They noted that in 2021, Iraq received $10.5 billion in U.S. dollars worth of investment under China's Belt and Road infrastructure. That means that Iraq has become the third biggest partner of China's Belt and Road Initiative and energy engagement after Russia and Pakistan. I actually hadn't known that before I found this article. That's actually very significant. That shows that Iraq has become one of China's most important partners in the Belt and Road Initiative, up there with Russia and Pakistan, which are key top U.S. allies of China. So this is very significant. The Belt and Road Initiative is going full steam ahead in West Asia, helping to develop infrastructure, and China is building schools for Iraqi children, benefiting the people of West Asia who have been bombed and occupied for so long by the U.S. Here are some photos of Chinese diplomats at this ceremony announcing the beginning of the construction of 1,000 schools in Iraq. You can see them meeting their Chinese and Iraqi officials. So that difference could not be much starker. China is bringing 1,000 schools to Iraq. What did the U.S. bring to Iraq? 1 million deaths. 1,000 schools, China. 1 million deaths, the U.S. Here's an article in Reuters, which is basically a British regime mouthpiece. It has a history of being funded by the British government and working on behalf of British propaganda outlets, British propaganda agencies during the First Cold War, and basically plays the same role today. They admitted back in 2008, this was just 5 years, 6 years really, into the illegal U.S. invasion of Iraq. And British invasion, I should say. Tony Blair backed it as well. Here's Reuters, 2008, quote, Iraq conflict has killed 1 million Iraqis, survey. So they use a propaganda euphemism. They refer to the war, the brutal neo-colonial war of aggression waged by the U.S. and the U.K. as the Iraq conflict. Oh, just a peaceful conflict. Anyway, more than 1 million Iraqis have died as a result of the conflict in their country since the U.S.-led invasion in 2003, according to research conducted by one of Britain's leading polling groups. The survey was conducted by ORB, Opinion Research Business, with face-to-face interviews. It found that 20% of people in Iraq had had at least one death in their household as a result of the conflict, rather than natural causes. That is to say, they were killed in this war. So they did this calculation based on what they had previously had, and they found that from the beginning of the war in March of 2003 until this was conducted in August and September of 2007. In over 4 years, there were roughly between 950,000 to 1.1 million deaths in Iraq. So, a million deaths. And by the way, that's not the only scientific study that has concluded more than 1 million Iraqi deaths caused by the illegal U.S.-British war on their country. This is a blog post that I wrote back in 2015, and I reposted it at multipolarista.com. Over 1.2 million people killed in U.S. wars on Iraq and Afghanistan. This is according to a study, a scientific report by a Nobel Prize-winning group called International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. The executive summary of the report tried to analyze the body count. I should say that the report is called Body Count, Casualty Figures After 10 Years of the War on Terror. So this was published in 2015, and the study, the investigation concluded that this is an exact quote from the report, from this Nobel Prize-winning group. Quote, they're talking about the U.S. war on terror. Quote, the war has directly or indirectly killed around 1 million people in Iraq, 220,000 in Afghanistan, and 80,000 in Pakistan, i.e. a total of around 1.3 million. And again, I need to stress, this was in 2015 when this report was released. The U.S. war in Afghanistan continued until 2021, and the U.S. war in Iraq really continued still, honestly, up until today. There are still U.S. troops there. This figure of 1.3 million deaths in the U.S. war on terror also does not include countries like Yemen, which have been targeted by the drone war and a borderline genocidal war since then, which began in 2015 in March, and over 370,000 Yemenis have died according to the United Nations. This report notes that the 1.3 million deaths, including 1 million deaths in Iraq alone, quote, is only a conservative estimate. The total number of deaths in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan could also be in excess of 2 million, whereas a figure below 1 million is extremely unlikely. Again, this is from a scientific report from a Nobel Prize-winning group, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Now, the preface of this report was written by a former UN Assistant Secretary General, Dr. Hans von Spaak, who was also previously UN Humanitarian Coordinator for Iraq. And he wrote, von Spaak wrote in the preface of this report, quote, governments and civil society know now that in all accounts, these assertions have proved to be preposterously false. He's responding to Western media reports and governments claiming that only 100,000 Iraqis died. Maybe only 200,000 Iraqis died. He is saying that these assertions have proved to be preposterously false, and he said facts are indeed stubborn. He was saying that the actual figure is around 1 million, maybe more. And the U.S. affiliate of this Nobel Prize-winning group, the U.S. affiliate is called Physicians for Social Responsibility. They wrote, quote, unfortunately, these deaths of the U.S. war on terror, they're saying, have been effectively hidden from our collective consciousness and consciences by political leaders seeking to pursue military solutions to complex global issues with little, if any, accountability. It also estimated that these wars had cost trillions and trillions of dollars. So that's the difference between the U.S. and China. The U.S. claims that China is trying to create this colonialist empire and recolonize, or not because it hasn't colonized, and colonize Africa. Absurd projection. The U.S. bombs Iraq. China builds schools in Iraq. The difference could not be any more stark. And these Western imperialist accusations against China are simply hypocritical projection.